Some characters are just built different. Gandalf, Kratos, Doomguy, these characters all essentially have in common the idea that they could probably single-handedly defeat the entire population of other universes in a fight, but they're still technically mortals. These are characters we see in all sorts of fictional media, and I think they're worth discussing, because they require some careful writing to come off the way that people tend to want them to. Whatever setting they're in, the main thing that defines a godlike mortal is that they're a character that, for whatever reason and in whatever way, is a full order of magnitude beyond most other characters that they share their story with. These can make for intimidating villains, extremely helpful secondary protagonists, and very powerful POV characters. We'll start with them in the form people tend to be the most excited and sometimes least patient to write in. Part 1, Godlike Protagonists. Otherwise known as almost every RPG character after you've done all the side quests, these are your main characters who have achieved this level of near immortal power. They're the natural evolution of a great deal of characters in video games, of superheroes, or of fantastical wizards. The main issue with these characters tends to be maintaining stakes and general consistency with the rest of the world, and we'll get there, but I actually want to start on these guys with what might be the biggest thing that differentiates these kinds of characters from one another. And that is, were they always this way, or did they grow into it? The answer to that question will spawn entirely different kinds of stories and characters. It's the difference between Superman and, say, Deadpool. Well, there's a lot of differences between them, but it's one of the foundational ones anyway. The point is whether this character you've written is actually used to their level of capability, whether they've grown up being this near immortal being, or if it's something they achieved or was otherwise bestowed upon them. A character who is born this way may not be a god, but they are undeniably something other than a baseline person, especially because the world they inhabit is not likely to operate under the same rules that they do generally. A lot of their developmental years would be spent learning how the world reacts to them versus how the world reacts to the people who surround them. There are plenty of ways to make a character this way. Maybe they're an alien, maybe they're blessed by the gods, the result of genetic experimentation, perhaps some prophecy has preordained their future glory. It's sort of for this reason that characters who have always been this powerful tend either to work really poorly or very well, because there are two bespoke issues that can arise when writing characters this way, and they will both become very obvious if the writer hasn't solved them within their story. The first is essentially having them act like they're anybody else, or with the implication that they did act like anybody else up until the point that the story starts. If you're so powerful that you expect to have a significantly increased lifespan, that you can lift cars or fight dragons at age 13, unless that's for whatever reason very common in this world, they're going to be something of an outcast, or at least they will stand visibly apart from the rest of society. Megamind is practically about this in regards to how it handles Metro Man. He's popular, beloved by all, basically what everyone who wants to write a self-inserty, superpowered protagonist could ever want, but that never really changed the fact that he was always other from the people he protected. He could never truly be one of the citizens of Metro City. He was Metro Man more than a man. Just because an always powerful protagonist is different from the people who surround them doesn't mean they have to be jaded about it, that it has to ruin their life or something, but it should consistently be on their mind, or subconsciously affecting the way they interact. Even putting aside any particularly world-bending powers, even simpler things that are common for these characters completely would ruin one's standard life plans. It would be hard to feel right seeking out a romantic partner or ever having kids, for example, assuming such is possible for this kind of character, if you knew that you'd outlive not only your spouse, but also your kids and maybe your potential grandkids. This might be a topic worth expanding on if we ever do a video about immortals, but it's worth saying even now. The other problem, of course, with inherently superpowered characters is naturally going to be stakes. Stakes are the biggest killer of all godlike mortal stories, but born this way godlike mortals most of all. Superpowered protagonists who still remember their days of helplessness, who fought near impossible or losing battles before achieving their current status, have memories of not having always been on top. There were likely stakes regarding their potential death earlier in their stories, but for those who were almost always basically invincible, those losing battles and those stakes have probably never existed for them unless you challenge them with other characters of near equivalent power from almost the beginning of your story. And that can risk making it stagnant and difficult to actually grow your character's capabilities as their story progresses. This can generally be solved in a narrative sense by just focusing more on the actual character and exploring what being them is like. It's a unique opportunity worth pursuing, considering this particular variant is the furthest one from reality, and so there's a lot you can do to try to explore what being someone like that would feel like. When you're writing characters that were not born near immortal, you're essentially writing every other protagonist up to a certain point. Almost every normal person-esque protagonist grows in many ways, including power, whatever that might mean, throughout their story. The difference here is that their ceiling is a lot higher. Maybe it's because they can achieve these ever-expanding levels of magic, or can in some way learn new powers, or master existing ones in ways others can't. But either way, these characters allow you to ratchet up the spectacle a lot as time passes. The stakes problem can still exist, but it's going to be less pronounced until you get closer to the end of the story. Every writer with a story about a conflict that may end in a fight, which is quite a lot of them, has to contend with the idea that the general default expectation, especially for stories with superpowered protagonists, is that this protagonist will eventually win. In these stories, where the protagonist's trajectory of growing ever more powerful is going to be particularly obvious, as they go from barely being able to throw another person around to toppling skyscrapers, it's going to be hard to convince an audience that your villains ever really stand a chance at beating them. A godlike antagonist versus a regular protagonist is a tense fight with uncertain outcomes. An audience may have an easier time believing the protagonist might lose, or at least suffer a lot before they win. But with a godlike protagonist versus a godlike antagonist, it might end up feeling like plot armor and the meta-narrative needs of the story are the deciding factor, and that's never really going to feel great. These problems, as with the other type of protagonist, are best solved by making them interesting characters. Watching a boring character you know is going to win in the end fight will be about as fun for the audience as swimming through cement. If the character is interesting, if you engage with the way their capabilities affect their relationships, their self-perception, even the way they do simple things like make a cup of coffee in the morning or interact with strangers they pass on the street, then you can deprioritize the stakes in the audience's mind and just take them along for the ride on the journey of a character that they've come to enjoy. And as in most stories, you might have to be creative to have a conventional protagonist beat a very powerful antagonist. The vice versa is very good too. Villains totally outmatched by their heroic counterparts yet who still outsmart them can be incredibly interesting if handled intelligently, and doing so will help keep your stakes alive, of course. But with them out of the way, let's step out of the protagonist's shoes and talk about Part 2, Godlike Allies. Godlike allies are another pretty common archetype. These allow you to implement world-bending feats without having to manage a POV protagonist who can wield them, so in some ways they're the best of both worlds. Not super hard to write without breaking the story, yet still a lot of fun, and a good way to up the scale of what's going on in your story. However, your first thought is almost certainly, but J-Bat, these characters are like the #1 source of Deus Ex Machina. And honestly, that is essentially true. The thing about allied characters, particularly of this sort, is that there's a temptation to sort of sprinkle them and their powers in here and there whenever the author wants some big spectacle, and then hook them back out of the story whenever their move is done. But we can sort of discuss when this is and isn't the case by talking about one of the best and most well-known examples of this archetype, Gandalf. Gandalf is many things rolled into one. He's our mentor character, he's a godlike mortal ally, he's a likable friend to our main protagonists. We're shown his incredible capabilities very early on in Lord of the Rings through the tricks he pulls at Bilbo's birthday party, and just by the way other people talk and think about him. In essence, whenever Gandalf pulls some crazy stuff, nobody ever has a particularly hard time believing he's capable of doing so. Even cheating death, which might feel like a major cop-out for other characters, doesn't really break the view of him, because it becomes clear he was always something a little beyond a really powerful mortal wizard. Yet, for all this power, it's not he who transports the ring to the fires of Mount Doom and casts it into the magma, nor does he use much of his power to actively assist Frodo and Sam on their journey towards Mordor once they split off from him. This all being the case despite the fact that their journey is as, if not more important than what Gandalf actually ends up doing. Sure, part of the reason he doesn't assist is because he's still temporarily deceased by the time Frodo and Sam split from the others, but it's also due to the nature both of his understanding of what they have to do and Tolkien's thematic purpose for Frodo and Sam's journey. Ultimately, Frodo and Sam's quest is about two unsuspecting people, the last types you'd expect to be the world-saving heroes, doing what must be done even though at many times they really don't want to save the world because of the honest love they have for their friends, home, and one another. The meta-narrative reason Gandalf can't take the ring and fly it to Mordor himself is because him doing so would defeat the purpose of the story. This is something most writers will get when writing Godlike Allies. Unless they're really lost in the weeds, most people understand that they can't just write a side character to do everything for the protagonist, because it'll ruin the story for the audience. But it's in reasoning within the universe that people often struggle. Sort of similarly to being the case with magic systems, the most important thing to consider when writing a godlike ally is what their godlike powers don't let them do to service the story. In Gandalf's case, it's because he's exactly the kind of target the ring could tempt easily. He's a master of magic and understands the plight of Middle-earth, even those plights which will not be solved by Sauron's destruction, and the ring can speak to that. He's aware he would fall where the hobbits wouldn't, and that makes it a matter of his character, not his powers, that determines his inability to just do the quest for them. Similarly, there was a story I heard about a D&D campaign that I'm probably half misremembering, but the version I'm about to tell will still illustrate my point. The D&D party had struck an alliance with some sort of greater planar being, as they had a common enemy in some evil planar being of some kind. While it was true that that ally of theirs was godlike and more powerful than any single one of the party members, when it came down to the final fight of that campaign, their ally was fighting off one or two of the evil demigod things, sure, but the party members had to deal with the last one, and potentially the strongest, by themselves. In-universe, in a narrative sense, they had a chance at winning the day because their ally was holding off the other evil demigods, but in a practical sense, for the players who were at that table, they still got an epic final boss battle to themselves, to which their victory, not their allies, determined the fate of the world, but still got to enjoy the expansion and scale and scope offered by knowing another fateful battle that was contingent on theirs was going on not far away. In essence, the most important thing with godlike allies is making them useful, but not too useful, but also not wasting them. If you give them great powers they never use, the audience will just think that they're stupid. But of course, you can't allow them to just do the plot for the main protagonists. Strike that balance well, and you can up the scale and stakes of your story, allow for crazy things to happen you don't quite want to trust to your protagonist's set of powers, and otherwise include a potentially very interesting character archetype. But finally, of course, we're to discuss Part 3, Godlike Antagonists. Sometimes you're a JRPG writer and the natural conclusion to your story is to kill an evil god, or someone quite close to it anyway. Of all godlike characters, this is almost certainly the most common to be explicitly stated. Sometimes the protagonists will achieve a similar status, practically speaking, before the final showdown, but the antagonist is the only one explicitly depicted as being so near to immortality. But I digress. It's no surprise why this archetype is so common. People like high stakes, believe it or not. I've said that word like a million times in this video. And one of the most visible ways to achieve them is to introduce a villain with world-bending power, or at least somebody who will have world-bending power if allowed to win. While I do believe it to generally be true that scale isn't actually that huge of a factor in stakes, the audience will care a lot more about the fate of a town they've grown to love throughout a story than a broad, generic, the the whole world stake that is much more abstract to conceptualize. But setting up a villain strong enough to dominate the world, or to do so eventually, should the door be opened for them via their triumph over the protagonists, will make them intimidating. The main thing to consider here, and this problem is probably the most common of all the ones I've discussed in this video, is that much in the same way a godlike protagonist might have cases where they can logically solve the plot in a way that doesn't fit the writer's narrative, and thus cause a major plot hole, godlike villains can do the inverse. There are too many stories where a godlike villain should easily, effortlessly destroy the protagonists, and yet they don't for stupid plot reasons. This can be anything from them abstractly not activating the super weapon until the protagonists have conveniently escaped safely, to knocking down the protagonist in a fight and then just not finishing them off for some reason. It happens all the time in little ways, and this in particular is a fairly cited factor in a lot of media people have ended up hating, especially of late. This is a factor as present in the Star Wars sequels as in the last season of Stranger Things. Often writers will say that the villain's pride has prevented them from striking the killing blow. They're so consumed by the inevitability of their victory that they forget to actually achieve their victory. Or perhaps they're just toying with the protagonist because they want to savor their defeat and instead give them an opportunity to escape or turn the fight around. You're familiar with these sorts of cases from all the bad B superhero movies and all that sort of thing. And these can be difficult to deal with because it is true that villains do benefit from having flaws like this, where their pride becomes self-destructive, where their sadism prevents them from actually finishing off their enemies, or where their greed becomes the instigator of their own downfall. But when done poorly, when the protagonists leave gaps far too wide and obvious for the antagonist to not exploit, but then they still don't, it only makes them look stupid and thus crushes the stakes, but also makes the story just one of thousands with the same played out, and the villain lost because of his pride. Aren't I genius? When writing a villain who's going to be destroyed by their pride, it shouldn't be a situation of, haha, you're almost but not quite dead. I'm sure you have zero strength left despite the fact that you're actively drawing a weapon on me. I'll turn my back on you now. But you can still utilize pride if you just try to do something different with it. One where the villain sets up the circumstances that allows for their destruction can work, whereby even allowing the final fight to happen where and when it does, they've already made a misstep that they might not even ever realize that they've made, or if they do realize, it'll have been too late. I mean, let's take my newest favorite series, the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. Spoilers for the first novel in the series, but I'm not going to be super specific. In essence, the younger of the two royal brothers, whose name is Regal, wants to coup his brother and intends to discard the protagonist, Fitz, in the process. Throughout the novel, Regal has dismissed Fitz, who is the bastard of the now dead eldest brother of Regal, as someone unimportant and essentially incapable. The specifics of the way Regal is defeated is something I'm going to leave out, and I'd encourage you to just read these books instead. But his failure doing this was, though the audience may not even know it at the time, already essentially guaranteed because he set aside Fitz as a non-threat who did not demand his consideration. It's something we've been able to see in Regal since the beginning. It's perfectly in character for him to act the way that he does, and the way in which he dismisses Fitz isn't stupid more than it's prideful. He has his reasons to disregard Fitz and was working fairly well with the information that he had. His failure was in allowing that self-certainty to cloud the fact that Fitz was, in fact, a person who would not take being sent to his death lying down, and who, had he been paying more attention, and had Regal thought a little more about his situation, he might have been able to figure out that Fitz was probably a little more capable than he was giving him credit for. When we watch how this all plays out, it feels very natural. There's no, I'll turn my back to you now moment. And that's the mark of an author who actually understands how to write stakes and how to use pride as a flaw without doing the same thing that people do almost every other time. That was a bit more of a rabbit hole about just writing villains more so than the godlike specifically, but the overall point is that these kinds of errors are easier to make with godlike villains than any other type. If their power is great, so too is their logical ability to ruin your plot if there isn't enough extenuating circumstance preventing that. You can't have your domineering Dark Lord of an invincible army of darkness be defeated by your village farm boy hero just because. There needs to be actual reasons the Dark Lord didn't just burn down the farm boy's village when he was an infant, or doesn't just blow up the planet, or just finish off the protagonist in his weakest moments. And if you ever find yourself approaching one of those impasses where the only option seems to be writing the antagonist to act that stupidly, that's a sign to probably just rewrite the scene. It'll be worth it. But that'll about do it for us today. Hopefully I've given you some ideas of worth in regards to writing godlike mortals. Anyway, if this sounds like a place you want to be, we have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos early. As we close out, I'd like to thank those patrons of ours: Shadowrunner, Sani, Isaac Parrott, Raymond, Don, Sadako, Cavalier, Sazabi, Shieldmaid, Fenya, and special thanks to our new patron, Michelle, of the Knights of the Inner Circle. Vion and Jodion Void, our knights, and Greer, TOW, Craig, Victoria, Lauren, and Noah, our loyal squires. And remember, super-strengthed godlike characters would probably break a lot of drinking glasses. Maybe they drink from cups of something more durable.